Today on Yellowstone Teton's Traveled podcast.
So you usually start out fishing some patterns that represent the Dunns, and then the spinners come back in large concentrations. And anybody who's really focused on Tricos all across the country, because they occur on all kinds of different spring creek type waters, you can look down the shorelines and see little clouds that look like little fog patches, which are actually spinners.
Mike Lawson breaking down the Trico hatch, the hatch chart, Mike's fly box, and back to the ranch today on Traveled. Welcome to Traveled, where it's all about the journey we are all on in fly fishing and in life. This is our chance to take a deep dive into a specific area around the country so you have a better feel for the people, the resources, and the community that make this part of the country so unique. Before we jump into it with our guest, I wanted to share a little love with our Traveled sponsor. This podcast is powered by Swing Outdoors and the Wet Fly Swing podcast and Yellowstone Teton territory. You can head over to wetflyswing.com/Teton right now, and if you get a chance to visit a hotel, lodge, fly shop, anything else going on in Eastern Idaho, you support this podcast by checking them out and clicking online. This week, Mike Lawson takes us into the hatches of the Henry's Fork. We find out which are the most prominent hatches out there, which flies you need to match the hatches we're digging into today, and we get some of Mike's favorite patterns, plus tips on fishing them. We're going deeper. The first one we had with Mike, we touched on a specific hatch, and this one we're going deep into all things Henry's Fork. Time to experience the road less traveled. Let's go. Mike Lawson from henrysforkanglers.com. How you doing, Mike?
Doing great.
Thanks for putting this one together. We had John. It's been a while. I always look back at these. It's been over a couple years, I guess. Episode 190. We talked a little about a little more general and got into the Greendrake hatch a little bit today. I was gonna dig into some more dries, and we're gonna be heading out there actually this summer. Later, I guess this fall. So I want to talk a little about that. But give us an update. In the last couple of years, I know you've kind of changed, right? You're still around the shop, but you've changed your roles. What's been going on the last couple of years?
I kind of took the general manager hat off, and I'm just more a senior consultant now. But I still spend some time up there. I was up there Saturday for, I can't. It's hard for me to stay all day anymore because I don't have anything. I need to work on a computer, and I do that at home.
Gotcha. So you came up. So occasionally when you get when they need you for something big, you'll come up and still hit the Henry's Fork?
Oh, yeah, I'll say.
Yeah, cool. What was did you have a trip last week you were up there on?
Well, no, I haven't been doing any fishing or guiding or anything. I've been doing quite a bit of fishing on my own.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. Well, like I said, we are going to be coming up there kind of later in the season this year, but I was curious to kind of just dig in. Now it's kind of we're going into June. It's going to be July pretty quick. And we talked about the Greendrake hatch, and maybe I wanted to dig into a couple other ones. Remind us again on the Greendrake. When's that one typically pop out there on the Henry's Fork?
It usually starts sometime after June 15th. I'd say the average time when it really gets going is about June 22nd or so. The fish have to have a little time to get accustomed to those big things before they get feeding on them too much.
Yeah, right. Okay. And right now, it's as we speak, we're kind of coming up into kind of June's happening this week. What's going on? What would be typically happening like right now in kind of the June period, other than the Greendrake?
Well, we're into more of a normal kind of a situation like we used to. Over the past few years, everything's been early. And this year we had a big snowpack and a late spring. So right now the water is pretty high, which we like it. It's a little off color, very high, and we're right in the start of our Salmonfly hatch. So that's where everybody's focusing right now.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's right. Salmonflies. Yeah, and right now it's so late May. And typically, how long will that Salmonfly hatch go on there?
It's generally a week or 10 days. It's not real long, but they have golden stones mixed in with them, and the salmon flies all hatch in a real concentrated number, and the goldens are kind of spread out a little bit, so you can have some pretty good golden stone fishing clear through June.
Yeah, through June. That's right. And what is I guess when you look at, I mean, on the Henry's Fork at least, it's kind of, that's what it's known for, right? Just the technical dry fly fishing. It has everything. Are people coming there? Does it matter, Roy? I guess, are people coming there to focus on specific hatches out there, or is it more just kind of, people are covering like whatever, you just show up and then whatever's hatching is hatching?
Well, there's no question that we're busier when we have the big hatches like salmon flies, Greendrakes, and such. But normally people are coming out most of the year to fish because there's usually always something going on.
Yeah, that's right. And what would be, so if you looked at like later in the season, so we'll circle back around to this time, dig in a little more. But if you're looking at kind of later September into October, and a year like this, when you get, I guess, more normal year, what would you typically, might you find in that later part of the summer or fall?
Well, you don't have as many different species, but you have some good fishing, mostly with blue wing olives, and they get pretty concentrated, and so the fish will key into them, and you may have some Mahogany Dunns that carry over to the end of September. They're a little more early September, and then depending on what the year's like, if it's or the weather at the time, if it's hot and dry, then ants and beetles and that sort of thing still work pretty good.
Oh, right. And all the Trxstle and stuff. Nice. Okay. So, and like you said, so there's not Roy. I mean, if we were coming there, whether it was June, I mean, I guess it is talking about the seasons. Typically you got kind of late, you got May, June, July, August, September. And then when kind of on the other end, so when does it kind of, I guess people are fishing like what, through all the way through into like November, or people hitting that year round?
Well, there's not a lot going on after, depends on when it starts getting real cold, usually in around Thanksgiving or so. There's usually still some stuff going on then, just depends on what the weather does. And then things start up again as soon as the snow starts to melt a little bit, like in February and especially March, April.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, perfect. So let's go. Let's just walk through a few of these, and I know there's actually a cool hatch chart on the Henry's Fork. I believe this is Henry's Fork anglers.com, right? And so, and I mean, I guess you probably had a part in this hatch chart. Did you have? I'm not sure if you know the one I'm talking about on your website there.
Oh yeah, I actually did the hatch chart. Some of the pictures are from John Schollmeyer in Oregon of the insects, but a lot of those insect pictures are ones that I've personally taken too.
Oh, good. Okay, yeah. And this is really nice because you got some photos and you got some. And let's remind everybody too that didn't catch that last episode we did on your book and stuff like that. Talk about that, what you have out there, because I know you've got a couple that would be a great resource if somebody's hitting the Henry's Fork.
Well, yeah, the first book I did is it's a well, it's not hardcover anymore. It's a paperback. Both these books were published by Stackpole. And the first one, Spring Creeks, is more of a general how-to, and it's not anything to really do with where to go. It was just how to fish spring creeks, what hatches to expect, how to approach fish, all that sort of thing. Then the second book is more where to fish and how to fish there, and that's specifically focused on the Henry's Fork and a couple of the smaller tributaries.
Yeah, Henry's Fork. That's right. Okay, and so that's good. We'll put a link in the show notes to that at the henrysforkanglers.com. And I guess just maybe we'll keep on that line a little bit for those that maybe missed that last episode we did. As far as what you have going, the Henry's Fork Anglers, obviously, that's your shop. But I think in the last few years you've sold that. Or describe where that's come from, because you built one of the most well-known fly shops. Probably definitely in the West, if not the country.
Yeah. Well, we started it actually in 1976, and then in 1999 we ended up selling it to Mark Rockefeller from New York. Mark loves to fish, loves to come out here, loves the Henry's Fork, but is pretty much I guess, a quiet owner. He doesn't get involved at all in so anyway, that we signed a contract in 1999 to stay on for 3 years, but we're still pretty much still here. My wife and I both.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. So yeah, that's what it was. So you planned to you signed the contracts down for a few years, and then you stayed on basically 20 years longer. Now that's pretty amazing. Like, what is it about? And I've asked this. We've had a number of episodes, like I said, covering some other shops and big names, people around the area. But what is it about the Henry's Fork and that part of the world that to you that makes it so special?
Well, it has so much diversity, and the very upper parts of True Spring Creek, and then it flows into a reservoir, and so it comes out kind of like a tailwater. That's Island Park Reservoir, forms the Box Canyon, fast water. Then you get about 8 miles of Spring Creek, really flat, wide, as it flows through meadows. Then it drops about 1,000 feet in elevation over the next 10 or 12 miles. And so it's very fast, a big canyon with some waterfalls. And then it comes back out into another reservoir, which is a power generating reservoir, but they don't have any water rights. So that it's just a flow through hydro. And then below there, it actually seems to have a benefit to the river because it helps cool the water down, and the flows are usually pretty manageable compared to some tailwaters.
Right. So it's the diversity. So basically, there's all from the small spring creeks up to the tailwater. You got it. You got it all in this fairly well. What is the length there that you just described? How many miles is that total?
Well, the whole thing from the Big Springs to where it uh, joins up with the main snake near Rexburg, it's close to 80 miles.
Yeah, 80 miles. Right. So there's tons of water. So when people are coming in to fish it for the first time, and they're thinking or kind of questioning, like, where do they start? Up, high, low. What's your recommendation typically on that?
Well, it depends on their experience, and it's hard because you have to visit with the people and kind of see where they're going to be if they're really into what they've read about the river and they're pretty accomplished angler. We can send them probably into the Harriman Park, but also depending on the time of year, it can be really great fishing down on the lower part of the river too.
The lower part. Okay, good. Well, let's maybe take it through, and I think this hatch chart is going to be something that will be kind of cool to not only have people take a look at, but just kind of walk through it a few here on the flies. Because, yeah, I mean, you have everything. It seems like you got every single mayfly you can imagine, plus you got caddis and like we said, some of the salmon flies as well. I guess kind of starting with the top of this on the hatch chart, you got the Greendrake. And we talked about, I guess, they're June, July, which is coming up quick. Is that one? What's the Greendrake? Give us a little snippet on that. What's that one look like? How do you prepare for the Greendrake hatch?
Well, the Greendrake is in the one that I personally know the least about, and that's the same with about everybody. Because by that I mean it's a little unpredictable. Some years you don't even hardly get any. The main part of that hatch occurs the further down the river you get. The nymphs are swimmers, and they like water when it's flooded. In the spring, that's when they really mature. They have to crawl out to emerge, the Dunns do. So they're going to need grassy, exposed areas on the banks and other structure. And then they all come to the river as spinners, all concentrated. So you really don't have a hatch that you can fish the Dunns, but it's a big concentration of spinners. They'll get back in the mornings, and again the evenings. They're about a size 10 or 12, and it can be really concentrated when it happens.
Okay. Yeah, so it can happen. So this whole hatch can happen literally in like a kind of a week's time and then be gone? Is that a possibility?
Well, no, that's the peak of it's about a week, but there's usually quite a few around for the next couple of weeks. I'd say 3 weeks or so.
3 weeks. Oh, and you got some patterns here, which is cool too. You've got some like the some nymphs, the feather duster nymph. You got, and then the Greendrake spinner, parachute Adams, of course, and some other flies. I guess, does it matter on the pattern on that? Just to get right size and kind of. I mean, I guess the Adams is a pretty generalist fly.
Well, it can, the hatch chart, and obviously it is hard to go back and edit it and change it,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
flies are flies are always changing. So the flies recommended on the hatch chart are pretty much generic patterns, but then when we get to specific patterns, we do carry some really good gray drake specific spinners, which is what you need to have. So, and sometimes I like to use a double setup. I'll use a parachute Adams so I can really see, and then I'll drop a spinner off of that about a foot, which are so you're fishing two dry flies, but the spinner is really difficult to see. So that's kind of what
Oh,
I like to do.
that's awesome. Yeah, I love that tip. So basically, run a Adams, kind of your generalist that you can see it really clear, and then just have that little tiny. Well, I guess it's not tiny though. You're saying like 10 or 12, right, for that spinner?
Yeah, 10 or 12. It's just that it's going to work best if it's flush in the surface film. So that makes it a little harder to see, even though it's big.
I see. Perfect. All right. Let's keep going down with this. I think we're gonna hit a few of these, and because it's really interesting as I look at these, and some of these I'm not even quite sure haven't even heard of these. So the next one you have, and again, this isn't like you said, you probably did this a while back, and there's some updates here, but I'm just like on the pink Albert. So talk about that. I don't actually know. I've never heard of that one. What's the deal with that? Is that still something going on?
Yeah, it's a western species of the Epeorus, which is what the Quill Gordon was supposed to imitate back east. And our western ones are much lighter and a little more almost pale morning dun colored, only with more of a kind of rusty pink color. And to be honest, they're probably the least important mayfly we have on the actual Henry's Fork. But they're real important on the main snake, on the South Fork of the snake in late July usually.
Late July. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. So and that's what you have. You have the peak of kind of the green is the peak, and then on the tail end, June, August, you've got the lesser peak. So okay. So the pink Albert's kind of more South Fork, the snake. So let's stay on the Henry's Fork then as we go here. So the Mahogany Dun, is that one that's pretty important for the Henry's Fork?
Yeah, it really is. It starts showing up in September, and it's a larger fly than we're used to fishing that time of year. Because by then you're mostly fishing Tricos and little ants and stuff, and the Mahogany Dun's about a size 16 or 18, and the peak of it's probably the first 2 weeks of September, and then a little bit before then, and depending on the weather, it'll go into October.
Okay, in October, and the and again, some of the fly, this is the probably the most maybe the most popular fly ever, right? Is the Sawyer's pheasant tail nymph. Is that still a good pattern to use if you're nymphing?
I think it's still the best. It's what I use.
Yeah, and then for dries, you've got the Mahogany Dun and the parachute. And so is that one have the same as far as you could hit the Dun and the spinner for that one?
Yeah, the spinners aren't much of a factor because they don't seem to come on in very strong numbers at any one time. So it's mostly the duns, and it doesn't hatch real heavy. You'll see them coming off, but the fish start looking for them. And that's important to remember because you can find fish feeding on, like for example, uh, tricos or little blue wing olives. But when they see a mahogany dun, which is much larger, they will take it.
Today's episode is sponsored by Eastern Idaho's Yellowstone Teton Territory, Idaho's most renowned zone for fly fishing, from the Henry's Fork to the South Fork of the Snake and all the high alpine lakes and streams in between. Yellowstone Teton Territory provides anglers and other outdoor enthusiasts with all the information they need to plan their next big trip. You can visit wetflyswing.com/Teton right now to get the full list of outfitters, lodges, fly shops, and all kinds of inspiration to get you started on your next trip to Eastern Idaho. That's Teton, Teton, wetflyswing.com/Teton. And so this is interesting because, the dry fly, I think for a lot of people is a big struggle, because there's especially here, there's so much, it's technical. They've seen a lot of bugs. What's your recommendation for somebody coming in there if, I think getting a guide would be probably the number one thing to do, maybe for at least a day or something. But if they didn't come in that, how do you explain that on the dry fly? How do you because we're going to talk about some of the flies and patterns, but what's the recommendation to find out really what's going on any given day that you show up or week?
Well, again, a lot of that is determined with their expectations and experience level, and if they're really have done quite a bit of spring creek fishing, so they understand how to make slack line casts, how to keep drag off the fly, that sort of thing, then we'll steer them into the Harriman Park and give them some recommendations on what to use depending on that, whatever the time of the season is. If they're a little less inclined, there's lots of other water that we will send them, and we do that with the guiding too. The more experience, there's people that come out just to fish the Harriman Park and focus on that, but I'd say that the largest percentage of our guide clients, that's not for them, because they usually, a lot of people that hire a guide, one reason they're doing so is to learn how to do it and how to catch fish, and not so much on just the experience of fishing. And in the Harriman Park, you got to have your mind right, because nobody catches very many fish in there.
Oh, right. So nobody, including, so anybody that even the most experienced, it's never going to be easy to get a bunch of fish.
That's right.
Yeah. Gotcha. This is cool. So Harriman, why? And that is the place. Why is that the place for the super? Because everybody knows it's the most challenging, and that's what is kind of the game. That's what makes it interesting, makes it fun.
I really think the biggest reason is just the tradition that's carried over from years ago. Nobody knew anything about. That's back when it was called the Railroad Ranch, and then some of our riders, especially back in the early 70s, Joe Brooks and Ernie Schwiebert and some of those, and pretty soon it was showing up in all the national publications. And so focus started showing up in big numbers here, and a number of them left with didn't meet their expectations, because like I said, it's not a river where you're going to find pods of big fish rising, that sort of thing. You really have to hunt for them, and you have to know how to approach the fish to get in position, have a pattern that's going to look like what they're eating, and then you got to be able to present the fly without any drag on it. So, that there's a lot of people that don't really like that, and because you may not catch anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the the analogy on whatever fish is hard to catch, right? Whether that's muskie or Atlantic salmon, you gotta kind of be able to take a little bit of pain, right, for the joy.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, I think, as far as your attitude. You go in just really hoping you get some good shots at fish. You're hunting for fish, and you can set up on a fish. I've spent 2 or 3 hours working on the same fish, and of course,
wow.
you don't stand there and just keep casting, because you make a couple of casts to a feeding fish, he'll stop rising, but he'll start again, and often he'll be in a little different spot, so you got to move,
All right.
and it's all kind of what a lot of people
Yeah.
like that, you know.
That's awesome. No, it sounds fun. I mean, yeah, it's not the just come in and start flogging the water with a bunch of casts. It's literally finding a fish and then targeting that and then sitting there. Like you might have to sit there for quite a while and you're just kind of, studying that fish, trying to get it. And then right, you get that take. So that's the ultimate thing. You're like, wow, okay. What would be your tips if somebody's sitting there, they got this fish that, maybe they put it down a little bit. Is it just you sit there and just give it an amount of time and wait? Is that what it takes?
Yeah, it's pretty hard to put the fish down for good. They're so used to anglers wading around, and they don't have any intelligence to associate the angler with them getting a fly stuck in their mouth. They they have the intelligence to decide, I'm not eating that again because it caused me trouble. But they don't know that the angler is the reason it happened. And so if they get a little uncomfortable, they feel your vibration in the water from wading. They see a few casts that drift over them. They'll either stop feeding for a while or they'll just move somewhere else and start again. And so if you feel like you have your one chance and then you blew it, well, sit down and on the bank or just if you're out in the middle of the river and just wait and eventually that fish will probably come back, but not always, but he probably will.
Probably will. And are you fishing, whatever it takes? So if the dries are on, you're hitting that, or you're fishing the equal amount nymphs? Is it kind of you're mixing it up, kind of do a little bit of everything there?
Well, when I fish nymphs, it's I only do it two ways in the ranch anyway. One is drop it off the bend of a hook with little or no weight off of a dry fly, but only drop it about 4 to 6 inches.
Gotcha. So that's it. So basically, that's the way to do it. It isn't like you're going to be fully just nymphing. It's literally you hitting dries, and then that nymphs is the trail. So
The
that's a
other
good,
time
yeah.
is not rising, and but then if just see a fish sitting there and under the water, he's not rising, he's moving around happy, then I know he's feeding on nymphs. So then I'll put on a nymph with a little weight on without an indicator or anything and just cast to the fish. And that's a lot of fun. I just don't think that the typical nymph fishing methods work very well in there because of all the weeds and the slow water, and there aren't concentrations of fish anywhere. So usually, if you just start covering the water with an indicator or something, you're not gonna probably aren't gonna do very good.
Yeah, yeah. So no indicator. That's not a key. Okay, perfect. So, and I'm just looking here again at that Mahogany Dun. You mentioned we talked about the pheasant tail, but so the Mahogany Dun parachute. There's a couple of dry flies. Would there be one you want to add here to a dry fly if that hatch was on?
I think there are a lot of good patterns. I always have liked the no-hackles over the years, but there's some other good flies too to imitate the Dunns. Compare Dunns are real good, sparkle Dunns, and then a whole variety of different kinds of emergers. They all can work pretty well. I have not found the trout to be over selective on mahogany Dunns because they don't hatch in big concentrations.
Oh, right. Right, right. So that's it. So they're not super selective. And on your boxes, what does that look like for your boxes? Do you have just on your personal stuff, do you have like a box for every species or do you have all your mayflies in one box? Like how would somebody, you know what I mean? It seems like there's a lot going on. How do you do it?
Well, I got lots of different fly boxes. The way I set mine up is first of all, I have some that are focused just on our spring creek fishing. And so those are going to be sparsely tied mergers, spinners, duns of a few different types. And then I also split those into I don't have just one box. For example, I'll have a box to fish the ranch for September, and I'll have some Mahogany Dunns, lots of different blue wing olives, and probably still some Tricos and Calibates. However, I usually put those Tricos and Calibates in another small box, and then I don't have one system because I'll have another box just for drakes, and we get three drakes here. We get green drakes, brown drakes, and gray drakes, and they're all about a size 10. So obviously I need a larger fly box. And so I don't really have any one real cool system.
Right. But you got it. Yeah, I see where you're organized. I mean, I like the monthly or at least a period, right? So you know if you're coming in late in September, October, you could probably have a different set of, a box, right, for those types of flies that you'd expect. Because we're talking, some of these are just like September, there's just going to be a lot of these bugs that might not be there, right? Some of the mayflies.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it. So, okay, well, let's keep going down this. We got a few. I mean, you got a bunch here. We're not going to get into it all, but I just want to touch on like Tricos, right? So that's a big one that people talk about all around the country. Tell us about the Tricos a little bit. What should we be thinking about for Tricos? Like first, talk about when those are there, and then how you might fish those.
Yeah, Tricos occur, probably the peak month is all through August, and they'll extend into the middle of September as well. Probably from the second week of August through the mid September, and they're a morning mayfly, and the Dunns emerge according to air temperature. So if the weather's pretty warm, like I don't know the temperature. I have a doctorate book that a guy gave to me just on Tricos. So,
Oh wow.
it can get a little complex as far as they really get into specific air temperatures and all that. But when the air temperature is right, the Dunns will emerge, and they actually can molt into spinners in the air.
Oh wow.
And so they're going to become a spinner within just a short time after they emerge on the same morning. And so you usually start out fishing some patterns that represent the Dunns, and then the spinners come back in large concentrations. And anybody who's really focused on Tricos all across the country, because they occur on all kinds of different spring creek type waters, and you'll usually the spinners will be so concentrated before they hit the water that you can look down the shorelines and see little clouds that look like little fog patches, which are actually spinners.
Wow, that is crazy. And the Tricos, I guess, are one of the smaller, right? Are they the smallest kind of hatch that you fish throughout the year?
As far as the individual flies, it'd be between Tricos, and then a lot of our blue wing olives are about the same size. Fortunately, even though you're matching our Tricos with a size 20 or 22 hook, that size hook would be a monster for back in the Midwest or the East Coast. Their
right.
Tricos are more like 24s and 26s.
Wow. And why is that? Is that just a different change of why are they so much smaller? They're just a different species or different life history?
Yeah, it's a different species than one we have out west, which is a little bigger.
Yeah, a little bigger. Gotcha. Okay. And you got a bunch of patterns here, all sorts of the CDC Trico spinner, the Renegade, which is a great classic pattern, the Royal Wolf. Is the Royal Wolf one that's still in your box that you got some of these old patterns? Is that still a good one?
Yeah, I still use quite a few Royal Wolves, Parachute Adams, and Renegades, which are all classic patterns, and I use them for a variety of things. You know, the Renegade is one that I just use a lot as a dropper. I fish it You can fish renegades a variety of ways, including swinging that works real good. But I like to just tie it off the bend of a fly that's a little harder for me to see, and then I can use the Renegade as a visual pattern, which is very easy to see because it has white hackle and brown hackle on it, and often the fish will take the Renegade. So it's just a good all around fly for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it says, I'm just looking here online. It says the Renegade, and I've known this fly since I was a kid and stuff. It says the Renegade was one of Ernest Hemingway's favorite patterns. I'm not sure if you knew that, but why is it? So it's kind of unique. Why it's got the peacock body and then it's got the brown hackle on the very back and then the white hackle. Do you know the history there with like on that fly, who kind of where it came from, why it's so different than a lot of dry flies?
I really have never studied it to see who developed it, and but it's a fore and aft tackle, and it's really could look like so many different things in my mind to the fish, and I think it's also important to realize that fish, as I alluded to earlier, we like to think of them as wily and smart, but honestly, they're not. They don't have much intelligence, and so you can play on their survival instinct is to be selective and just feed on what they know is food. That's kind of an inherited trait, but it's not a intelligence thing. So therefore, if something else comes by that looks like it's doesn't look like anything they're used to eating, but unless they're really focusing on one specific insect, and often they do, the renegade's a great fly.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great tip. I'm glad we brought that one up. And it looks like John Hagen was the person who developed it, a guide, and I guess maybe lives in Colorado. But
Good.
yeah.
Okay. But I'm sure that had to been a long time ago because I fished them when I was a kid.
Oh wow, yeah, yeah. They've been around a long time. Exactly. Yeah, that's really
Hmm.
cool. So, and then your patterns. It sounds like you have a good mix of some of those old traditional flies work great, as well as some of the newer, like whatever flies with CDC on them, stuff like that. Do you find yourself having a nice mix of kind of old school and newer flies?
Oh yeah, yeah, I do. If we're still on Tricos, I still like the hand spinner flush sits flush in water, but uh, there's a lot of really great synthetic wing material that you can use. The biggest mistake I see people is they tie the wings really too full, too they it need the wings need to be really sparse. It's a tiny little fly, and the fish can get selective on them, very selective, and so you can't always get away with trying a renegade or a little parachute Adams or something. You're gonna have to get right down and dirty.
Yeah, there you go. And I love that you talked about the tying, because we actually had an episode that came out on the Catskills. We focused on kind of that area and the Catskill style dries, and how they're different, right? What's your take? I'm not sure if you know much on the Catskills, like what makes them, but I guess they got this unique. It is kind of a sparser type pattern. Do you find yourself? Does that resonate with you? Just when you hear about Catskills, is that something you use out there, or is that just kind of an old school thing that's really not necessary to be thinking about?
No, for me personally, I've have a lot of admiration to the developers of a lot of those skill patterns because they they're tied much sparser than and it seemed like in the West, big bulky flies sort of were first developed when we started, realizing the fly fishing we have out west. Because as you know, in America, it started on those streams in the Catskills and the Adirondack Mountains there, and they're kind of a mix. They're not Most of them aren't true spring creeks, but they have a lot of flat water. They get fish pretty heavy, and so having a pattern that's sparse, that isn't tied so full, is very similar to what we like to do here. So we stock some of the old Catskill patterns in our store still to this day.
There you go. Yeah, and that's what is it. So they're more, yeah. You've got this technical. I mean, compared to some of the places in the West, like we just said, we're talking. We had an episode on West Slope cutthroat trout fishing, right? And that's like a totally different thing. Not as technical, right? You could probably throw out any fly to some of those West Slope cutties, and they probably take it. But we're not talking about cutthroat here, right? Or are we talking about what are the species? Remind us again on the species here on the Henry's Fork.
Well, we don't have a lot of cutthroats anymore. Originally, it was a cutthroat river totally. That was the only trout in it. It had, these are all Yellowstone cutthroats here. And, I think between the introduction of rainbow trout and some of the irrigation practices and stuff, the cutthroats are a lot more delicate as far as their different environmental requirements than rainbows and browns. So rainbows quickly displace the cutthroats, both with competition and also they interbreed, so they start making hybrids instead of pure cutthroat. And then, more recently on the lower river, we have brown trout as well as rainbows. But then, if you keep going downstream on the lower Henry's Fork, the very lower part, then you start picking up a few cutthroats again. And the cutthroat trout, I think that a lot of people sort of have a misconception about the cutthroat. There's a spring creek that I fish now and again. It's a little small one that eventually ends up in the South Fork of the Snake, and it has hardly any rainbows, but lots of browns and cutthroat. And in my opinion, the cutthroat are a lot harder to catch than the browns are, and they can get really selective.
Right, right. So they are. So the Yellowstone cutthroat are probably different than the West Slope cutthroat quite a bit as far as their behavior.
Well, yeah. I don't know if it's the species of fish or the habitat they're in, because most see, we don't have West Slope cutthroat here, but where they do have them, we have them up in North Idaho and northern Montana and all that, but they're usually living in streams that are a little faster, that are more freestone type streams. One of the great ones in Idaho is the St. Joe River, and it's just, there'll be long sections of quiet water and then riffles and all kinds of diversity, and that seems to be what they like.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, we just actually, you're right on, because we just did an episode on the St. Joe and we dug into it, and that's exactly it. It was like, we're talking to, our guest, and, he's basically saying, hey, yeah, this is pretty easy. Just come on up here. There's lots of room, So I'm guessing that St. Joe is quite a bit different experience than the Henry's Fork, right?
Well, yeah, because I don't think it's as well known to traveling anglers, and then they don't, it hasn't been publicized a lot, but it's a great river, but it's a little harder to get specific information on where to go, what flies to use, and all that. It's a little more trial and error, I think. But it's a beautiful river. It's one of the most beautiful trout streams I've ever fished. Unfortunately, it's going to be about 9 hours for me to get there, so I've only fished it a couple times.
Oh, wow. Yeah, 9 hours. And are you down south of, or where are you at? Like, where's your home base now?
Well, my home where I live I live right on the Henry's Fork, about 3 miles downstream from the town of St. Anthony. And that's about 40 miles downstream from the Harriman Park where our shop is.
Right. But you're on the Henry. Amazing. You're on the Henry Fork. And then, yeah. And so that part of the St. Joe we're talking about, I was looking at too, because on the map, if you're coming over from Spokane, heading on your way to Montana, it's kind of there, but you just have to kind of take a right turn and drop down into the Forest Service land, kind of get off the main highway or whatever. But
Yeah, and for us that live here in this part of the world, it's right in the corner of Idaho next to Yellowstone Park. Most of the middle of Idaho is all primitive area, no roads or anything. So for me to get to the St. Joe, the quickest way is to get on the freeway and go clear up. No, yeah, way up there, going over the pass to not. I don't know. Usually it's thinking of the Montana towns. I don't remember where I turn off, but it's usually not too far from St. Regis up in Montana.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty cool. We've been doing this. We've been not only doing a bunch of episodes in kind of eastern Idaho, but we've really been hitting tons of stuff in western Montana, that northern part of and into Canada too. Up into Canada, because you get into those places, which obviously there's a border between countries, but it's all the similar basins. And yeah, the thing you find out is just like there's just so much. Like the St. Joe's a good example, one of those rivers that a lot of people don't know about, but you could probably spend your life fishing that one, right?
Yeah, I haven't fished. Had time to fish all those rivers. I've wanted to fish a lot of those streams in southern Alberta and southern British Columbia for trout. Most of those fish are west slope cutthroats in those streams too, but I just haven't had a chance to do a lot of it. My main fishing up in the northern part of our state has been on the St. Joe and also on Kelly Creek.
Yeah, Kelly Creek. Okay. Well, let's jump. I'm looking back here. Another one I don't know that much about is the speckled spinner for the Henrys. Is that a important one to know?
It really is. It matches up with the Calibates species, and it's about a size 16, and it occurs in usually about the same time as Tricos. They come off, if you have a great day in late August, you would have Trico fishing from as soon as you get on the water, usually until 9 o'clock or so. And then by 10, between 10 and noon, depending on air temperature, that's when you get the Calibates. And they're not common on most rivers. They are more common on lakes, but some of our Spring Creek waters, like the Henry's Fork and Silver Creek and a few others, have some pretty good Calibates emergence. It's again they seem to hatch very sporadically, and maybe a lot of them at night, because we never see the Dunns much. It's all spinners.
Gotcha. So it's all spinners for this one too. So if you're picking patterns, you'd want to have, I guess, yeah. There's a couple here: Calibates, the cripple, the partridge spinner. So is that kind of
Yeah.
those would cover you? Any other fly? Another fly you'd throw out there? Hackle stacker. That's another one.
No, that's mostly it. If there are Dunns on the water, then the fish aren't very selective at all, and you can generally use a size 16 parachute Adams or something like that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, is the parachute Atom still one of those flies? If you had to pick the generalist dry fly, is that the great? Is that the best one, or is there a few that are kind of like the Adams?
That's a good question. I think it would be if I could only pick one general overall dry fly that would work on all of our different types of water. That's probably what I'd pick, is parachute Adams in a variety of different sizes.
Yeah, parachute, and that's mainly because I mean, again, that's one of those ones that's so unique, just the parachute style, right? Because you think parachute Adams. I guess there's other parachutes out there, but why is the Adams? Is it just because of that black and white and gray? That's just the general colors.
Well, I think so. I think that the Adams is just a terrific dry fly pattern, and I think it was developed into a parachute mainly to get a little lower profile and get better visibility.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trxstle, who has earned an exceptional reputation over the past few years in the fly fishing industry due to the popularity of their telescopic fly rod roof racks and statement-making artist series apparel lines. Their latest release for 2023 is the Geryon Universal Bike Rack Packing System, a brand new way to transport your fly fishing and outdoor gear. The Geryon will give any modern bike the ability to bring 30 pounds of gear with its front and rear articulated racks. Whether you ride a full suspension mountain bike, an e-bike, or even a carbon fiber road bike, the Geryon will get you and your fishing gear further faster and have much more fun along the way. I can tell you this has been a big struggle for me. I've been riding my bike, both road bikes and mountain bikes, and had lots of issues over the years packing my gear, whether that's crappy storage on the back or a trailer that's just too big and bulky. So I'm excited to share this packing system, which is going to make it way more convenient and accessible to get out to the places you need to go. You can learn more about how Trxstle is transforming the way you access your favorite water, backcountry hunting zones, and camping spots. Head over to wetflyswing.com/Trxstle right now and be the first on the water and the farthest upstream and away from the crowds. That's Trxstle, Trxstle. Trxstle, live your pursuit. So if you're thinking parachute, what about the parachute versus the regular Adams? When would you be using one or the, I guess you said it kind of getting down in the water, but what's that look like?
Well, anymore I rarely fish in Adams, and it used to be one of the main flies that I would fish. So obviously, I think on this river, I think the main reason to parachute Adams would be my preference over the regular Adams is just because of the profile that a parachute has in the water. I would use a regular Adams if I'm fishing riffle water or faster water, but I think the parachute's a little better suited most of the time.
Yep. And is the parachute, what is that? Is that imitating potentially the spinner and the Dunn and kind of the like all sorts of different parts of the life history?
That's what I think. I think where it puts the hook and the body right in the surface film, then it could look like a spinner, it could look like an emerger, it could look like a little Dunn coming off it. It could be a number of things.
Perfect. All right, we're going to hit on a few more of these before we get out of here, but we'll make this quick, but let's hit on some big ones. So let's just go down. Is the Flav, is that an important one?
It's a really important mayfly on pretty much all the Henry's Fork, both up in the Harriman Park and down on the lower river. It's probably my favorite, personally, my favorite hatch during the summer months. It's a larger mayfly, very close relative of the Greendrake, same coloration, and it'll be about a size 14. Most of them, sometimes they're a little smaller, 16s. They come off right after the Greendrakes do, or right during, sometimes late June, early July.
Perfect. That's it. And then fly patterns again. There's a few here. Any other flies you'd throw out there as a good, maybe a good dry imitation or nymph?
Well, I really like fishing the no-hackles for when the flavs are on. Either a no-hackle or a paradine, probably for me, work best.
That's right, the no-hackle. And what is the no-hackle again? Is that one of those things where it's when you want to get it down into the surface sort of thing? Or when would you use the no-hackle versus a hackled fly?
Yeah, I definitely think that the reason the no-hackle works so well is because it, in the fly bin, it looks like a Dunn, beautiful mayfly Dunn, but when you're actually fishing it, usually as soon as you start fishing it, the wings will start shredding and splitting. The individual fibers are split up, and the fly will sit low in the surface film. And so I honestly think most of the fish that feed on no-hackles actually think it's either an emerger or some sort of a cripple.
Right, that's it. And on the emerger, are you kind of getting down the weeds on that, like saying, okay, this is like actually fishing something even further below the surface, like so not quite the nymph, not quite the Dunn, but is there something in the middle you might also fish?
Well, you have to have a little bit of understanding of the surface film, which is called the meniscus. And it actually is if you look in a glass of water, you can see that there's a little concentration forming a little film with what it is compressed molecules. And so that surface tension, sometimes we refer to it, it can be a little bit of a barrier to an emerging mayfly or caddisfly. But then once they get on the out and they emerge, then they can use it to ride on the water on the surface of the
Right.
surface tension.
Yeah, that's it. So the flies are coming up. So basically, just the snippet of the life history. So the mayflies are coming out. They're coming up from the nymph and swimming their way up, but they get either caught on their way up, or I guess maybe they don't do that. But once they kind of pop out, they're in the film, kind of riding the film a little bit.
Yeah, and to be honest, most of the mayflies that we have, the nymphs don't really swim. We have a few types that can swim, like Baetis and the gray drakes, Calibates. Those are all swimming nymphs. But for the most of our important ones, we call the nymph group crawlers, which encompass pale morning duns, uh, greendrakes, flavs, and what brown? I guess no, not brown drakes. Mahogany Dunns. That's what I was trying to get to. Those all the nymphs. Just they actually, when you watch them in an aquarium, they look confused, like they don't know what's happening because the internal body starts to fill with some gas, and then the crawlers just end up at the surface whether they want to or not, and so they're usually stuck in the surface, under the surface, or just against. But it all happens right at the surface. I don't usually fish emergers down under the surface very far. They're usually right in the surface film.
Yeah, right in the surface film. Okay. And so we talked, brown drake, western green drake, those are similar timing. It looks like kind of, maybe talk about this, and we talked about the green drake before in general. Are those all pretty similar in that timing when they're emerging or on the surface?
Yeah, we've got 3 big drakes on the river. 2 of them emerge in the Harriman Park, but in different parts because they're completely different mayflies. Actually, all 3 of the drakes are not even closely related, other than they're all mayflies. Brown drakes, the nymphs are in. They burrow and they can swim. They burrow, so they're in the real slow sections of the water where there is a lot smaller gravel and sediment. And then gray drakes, they like wherever they can swim, and green drakes, they're just about everywhere.
They're everywhere. And that's the one we'll put a link in the show notes to that episode we did where we specifically went into the green drake, hit on that pretty good. So good. Well, those are the drakes. And as I kind of go down here, we haven't talked caddis a lot, and caddis maybe let's touch on this, the spotted sedge. How's that one look on the Henry's Fork?
Well, the caddis are really important on the Henry's Fork. Maybe not as much so as they used to be because the water quality or the habitat has declined a little bit for them. You start getting silt buildup, and that's the big enemy of all spring creeks. Is eventually they get silted in, and what that does is it fills in the little interstitial spaces between the rocks, and that's the spotted sedge is actually, the family is Hydropsyche, and they're a net maker. So that they don't have a little case, they're net makers, and so they need that kind of clean gravel habitat to really be effective. Anyway, that's kind of a quickie on
Right.
that fly.
Right. And some of the patterns you have here, we've got Lawson's, we got the partridge caddis emerger, you got the electric caddis, and the X caddis, right? The X caddis is another really popular name you hear about, right?
Yeah.
And that's basically just a big elk hair. Well, it's not a big elk hair, but it's a
A lot like an elk hair. Yeah, that's Craig Matthews pattern. But most of the fish you're going to catch using emergent caddis, and it's kind of a variation of what Gary LaFontaine developed with Antron. We tie them a lot sparser, put a little partridge wing on them usually, and I almost always drop the caddis emerger about 6 inches below a dry fly like a parachute caddis or an elk hair caddis. But you can catch fish swinging the fly really pretty well using these same kind of patterns.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's I guess that's it. I mean, these are casts, so you're going to be fishing this differently. You're not going to be. How does that look? So, I mean, are you fishing more, like you're saying, more of this kind of emergers, and just occasionally you'll get the caddis on the surface using some big dry fly?
Yeah, the caddis flies, especially these species and most others, they don't waste a lot of time at the surface like mayfly nymphs. They just pop right out, especially if it's a sunny day, and just sort of keep going. It's almost like they can fly directly out of the water. So a lot of times the adult's not as important as the emerger.
Right, and that's especially because the life history is different, right? Where the caddis, once they fly out, they're talk about that a little bit, just for those that wouldn't know. So you've got the dun. You've been talking a lot mayflies, dun, spinners. But what about the caddis? How are they? When are you hitting those? Are you hitting those when they're emerging and flying off, or when they're kind of back laying their eggs?
Well, you have both as opportunities to fish caddisflies, but you need to realize that they're not a nymph, they're a larva, like a worm. And so are important to realize there are a couple things: that the nymphs are swimmers, and they're another commonality with them is they're usually small. Size, I'd say 18s, maybe a little smaller or a little larger, blueing olive type, uh, two tails, and they're really extremely important. They're multi-brood mayflies, so you get the same hatch in the spring and March and April as you do in late September, October.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool. So that's it. That's the unique. Do any other of the mayflies have that multi-brood hatch process?
Some do, but I'm not sure which ones other than these little blue wing olives. Batis is the family of them, and there's a lot of different kinds of them though. But here we mainly have just two important ones.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. And so some of the flies, what would be a couple of dries that you would use for the imitate the blue-winged olive?
Well, I use the same type of flies as other mayflies, just tie them the proper size, and grayish olive body. The CDC emergers work really well. Little no-hackles. Sometimes I'll just use a little parachute Adams or a little similar fly, and then I'll drop a pheasant tail nymph unweighted about 6 inches below the top fly, and that can be very effective.
There you go. There you go. So it rides, and that's a good tip today. It sounds like a lot of that you could do. You could fish a little dry, or just a dry fly, and then trail it with a little 6 inches, a little tiny nymph with not much weight.
Yeah.
Perfect. The shop right now, if somebody was coming in and they were going to stop by the shop, who would they be running into there? Are you there throughout the day or part of the day?
It depends with me. I get up. I don't know which specific days. I was up there Saturday because it was busy, and I usually am there from the morning about 8 o'clock till about 1 or 2 on days when I am there. But who you would normally be looking for, of course, we have some very good seasonal employees that we see them every summer. But then our full-time employees, my son Chris is the manager, and Andy Jenkins is assistant manager. And so one of them will be in the shop virtually all the time.
Good. So Chris or Andy. So if they can't catch you, they likely will probably catch Chris or Andy in the shop, and they could pick their brain a little bit.
Right. They'll find one or the other. And these, you don't want to sell these shop guys short either, because what we do is we work them on a 4-day week. So they have 3 days off to fish, and that's all they do. So usually, if someone walks in the shop, you're probably going to be running into somebody a little more knowledgeable about exactly what's going on at the time you're there than if you get a hold of one of our managers and they only have 1 or 2 days a week to go fishing.
Gotcha. So that's the key. Yeah. So stopping by the shop, if nothing else, if you can't stop, I mean, I definitely want to swing by and check in. But even calling, right? You can give a call and just get an update of what's happening if you're heading out there.
Yeah, and make sure to use our website too. We've got all kinds of links on there for water conditions on the various rivers and the hatches, as you mentioned, and all kinds of very helpful information.
That's right. Yeah, regional. Yeah, you do have a nice regional water info, snowpack levels, and like you said, so this year you're expecting a pretty good season. There'll be plenty of water this year.
Yeah, we're excited because we haven't had that luxury in the last few years. So we had about 120% of snowpack, and then we've also had a good spring, and so everything seems to be right on track for a great year.
Great. Cool, Mike. Well, I guess one random one before we get out of here. What if we were coming into that area? What is there a restaurant or something you'd recommend for food to stop by, or what's your recommendation typically there?
Yeah, there's some real good options. One would be, of course, the one I'd promote the most. If it's lunch, we have a deli upstairs with fantastic sandwiches.
Oh, nice.
They also have some breakfast items, a breakfast burrito or breakfast sandwich.
Perfect.
So that's great for lunches or breakfast. For a sit down meal, I like the Trout Hunter that's right across the street. And then another one that's pretty good is Pond's Lodge, which is about 6 miles north of us. But there's a number of good restaurants in this area.
Gotcha. So Ponds Lodge, like Ponds, Ponds.
That's correct. Yeah.
Ponds Lodge, perfect. Okay, good. And we talked a little bit about your book. Is there another resource book or anything? We talked about Craig. We had him on a while back as well, that can take this conversation further. I mean, we're talking a little bit of entomology, you know what I mean, but it's more on the surface. If somebody wants to go deep on the aquatic insects of that area, where do you point them? Would your book cover, or is there something else?
Well, I've tried to cover the more recent information. Some of these mayflies by the scientists have been reclassified, and so we call them something else, but they're the same mayflies. And so even to just look at the hatches, I think Swisher and Richards' book, published I think in 1972, Selective Trout, that's still a classic, and will pretty much you can learn everything you probably need to know about mayflies. And then Caddisflies by Gary LaFontaine. It's still pretty much the Bible on caddisflies, and those are the two main ones. Then you can get a little more generic, probably for there's nothing all that big going on with stoneflies, for example. There's not a whole book about stoneflies like mayflies and caddisflies, but some of these other writers, like Dave Hughes, has done a great job. John Schulmeyer. There's a number of other books on so you can get the specifics on the hatches.
That's right. Perfect. Awesome. This will give us some information. So we're going to be putting this together in probably the next month or so. Anything else you want to leave us with here, Mike? This has been another great one as far as, person coming in there, say, let's just say they're coming in late September, October. What do you tell somebody? Any other words of advice for that person?
Well, yeah, you're going to fish different. We're going to recommend you fish different parts of the river according to the season because it's can be a little bit tough in the Harriman Park in the middle of the summer sometimes, and when it's hot and dry. But it's very good in the fall, very dependable. So that would definitely be a good option, but it's not the only option. The lower river down below Ashton, down to where I live, it's fantastic fishing in the fall. And the access is very good. The hatches are good. So that's another option that I think is really worthwhile.
Perfect. Awesome, Mike. Well, this has been a great one again. Appreciate you for doing this. We'll send everybody out to henrysforkanglers.com, and hopefully we'll get some people out your way, and I'm hoping to connect as well and see maybe meet you in person this year. So appreciate all your time today.
Okay, thanks.
That was Mike Lawson on Travel, part of the Wet Fly Swing podcast and Swing Outdoors. This podcast is supported by Eastern Idaho's Yellowstone Teton territory. You can support this podcast in Eastern Idaho by heading over to wetflyswing.com/Teton. That's TETON. And let any of the brands, companies there know that you found them through this podcast. Don't forget to check back with me if you have a area of the country you'd like us to check into. Send me an email at anytime, dave@wetflyswing.com. Reminder, we've got our big Euro School trip coming up this year, and we're going to be jumping into this part of the country. We're going to be fishing it not only this year, and this trip is actually sold out, but we're going to be swinging back next year for another one. So if you're interested, go to wetflyswing.com/Euroschool to get your name in. I'll follow up with some information for next year's trip. Okay, let's take one quick peek at one of those brands over there. Let's take a quick peek. wetflyswing.com/Teton. And that is going to redirect over to yellowstoneteton.org. And the front page, we got a bunch of snow, a rabbit, we got a map, Rexburg, Idaho Falls, upcoming events. Here we go. Oh, this is cool. So actually some of these events have already passed. I will still make note because there is a cool Women's Fly Fishing 101. I'm going to take a quick look at all events. This is a real easy way you can go take a look at what's going on. Take a look at the events calendar. Let's go over to travel. Let's go over to travel tools, travel guides. Let's go take a look at travel guides. See what we got going here. We're heading over here. Travel guides. Here we go. So we've got a bunch of travel guides. We've got the adventure travel guide. We got the rodeo and fair, off-road, hunting and fishing, snowmobile guide, arts and culture. Let's click on the adventure. I'm curious to see what the big moose is going to give us here. So adventure guide. Let's take a look at the adventure guide. So we got this big Teton Valley and the hot springs. It's basically a summary of some of the cool places Idaho Falls, and then it breaks it down by area. So there we go. So we got Miller Drift Boats in Ashton. We've got highlighting the Eastern Idaho. Getting here. Here we go on the ground. So we got rental cars, airport, scenic drives. Here you go. Hit the open road, scenic and historic drives. So this is some good stuff. Fort Henry Historic Byway, 97 miles. There you go. Got a quote here. The mantra, "It's the journey, not the destination," rings true for an Eastern Idaho adventure. All right, January, February, March, April. We're looking at the calendar. June, they got a whole bunch of months here. And then we got rodeos, counties and fairs. We got baseball. This thing is packed. It's like the infinite scroll. This thing just keeps going and going and going. This is amazing. This is a great resource. Okay. So, tons of resources. And then at the end, it's got a little bit of a summary of lodging facilities. There we go. And it's broken down by price. Very cool. Buttermilk, Island Park. So it's got everything. So basically it's got everything listed. Then we wrap it up. Leave no trace. Cool. All right. So that is it. That is the adventure guide. The visitor's guide for adventure. Okay. We will take another look next time at another guide. And I think we will dig into, maybe we'll see what the fly fishing and hunting guide has. And other than that, until we get to the next trip on the road less traveled, I appreciate you for supporting Yellowstone Teton and this podcast and checking in with us today. Talk to you soon.